think it's just, you know, maybe we could just touch on a little bit how this atmospherically translates to the surveillance state, the monitoring of movements, and this type of thing. I just read this book. I think we'll probably have him on the show. This book, Chaos, about the Manson era. And it's a incredible piece of writing. And he's really, it's a great book because what he does is he really, he tiptoes into like, even what, people like us would be like, oh, that sounds like conspiracy shit. And then what he does is he's just like, every single thing that's in this book, I can establish. It's either a FOIA request or it's multi-confirmed sources. And I don't know how it all connects together, but I do know all this stuff was occurring. And he makes a very persuasive case, at least to me, that Charles Manson and the family probably had something to do with MK Ultra experiments, which were just rampant across the country in the basically the late 50s through the 70s. And maybe it was really provocative, and people should look this up because this came out in the church committee, and Sidney Gottlieb, who was the head of the program, had to testify. Again, this is all, this is all stuff we know. And he kind of framed it as, one, clearly they did not want to fully, face up to the fact they were dosing people, including a lot of psychiatric patients and prisoners with LSD without their knowledge. And almost certainly have caused people's deaths, as well as a number of other things. But that, this just didn't work. And, the book is implying that maybe to some degree it did work. And, the only reason that I bring this up is because I think the idea that, COINTELPRO or whatever else is just like a specific manifestation of like an ultra reactionary paranoia in like the defense and intelligence establishment in the 60s and 70s and 50s is wrong. And not only is it wrong, there is a tendency today, there's a certain type of very accepted liberal discourse where it's like, well, if it's something like the CIA did in 1973, we should really talk about it. If it's something the CIA might be doing in 2020, then nah. So
yeah. That's another reason why Wildfire we've identified supporting groups to build healthy internal cultures, because if you have an unhealthy internal culture of your organization, it is so easy to exploit. And so when in COINTELPRO, they would find out who is the alcoholic in the organization. Let's try to get him to, let's take him out for a drink, or,
right.
Let's write fake letters to someone's spouse causing conflict saying that they're cheating. The ability in this age to cause disruption is just infinite. And so if you don't have a solid set of norms of how you move in the world through building real trust and kindness and care, it's just so easy to get disrupted. And it's not just here in the Bay Area, for example, there were war games like this JLAS stuff that the police department was doing with all their military gear. It was called Urban Shield. And they were doing war games around these scenarios as well. They were doing them around what they called eco-terrorists. And so they were literally training to fight activists with all the new tanks and stuff they got. And that there was actually a long-term grassroots campaign here that actually ended that from grassroots activists. You can Google Urban Shield Oakland and find some cool histories on it. But
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Do you think on the flip side, I'm reading this, and also I read RAND reports sometimes as well, and it strikes me that the left actually needs infinitely more of that type of thinking. Long-term horizon building, serious assessments. One thing that really drives me fucking crazy, and it's not just on the left, it's partially a product of online discourse, is a really simple principle. I think it goes back to Hume or something, has some type of origin like that. The difference between is and ought statements and how that connects with understanding just objective realities. Or empathy exercises that you're not bound by. You want to try as broadly as you can. I think, yes, there is spiritual implications of empathy, of course. There's also cognitive empathy. And what I think is interesting when we read some of these scenarios, I mean, the RAND stuff is more serious. The military, I mean, it's disturbing because of what it implies, but it's also kind of silly. But I mean, you have even as they are literally writing scenarios to crush domestic dissent and global dissent on urgent and correct issues, ecology and inequality. They have a deeper through line into how the quote unquote enemy is thinking than almost all analysis that I hear on the left. So I want to also invite that, like, scenario planning, things like that from the corporate world, from the military, actually can be extremely helpful. And I know that this is part of the wildfire mindset.
Yeah, there's two things I want to say about that. First is that what strikes me about both the Zebellion thing and the other RAND thing is how specific they are with what they think the activist demands are. Like, I'll read another sentence where their description of this, like, fictitious group, the World Environmental League, said, is spearheading a crusade to compel the UN General Assembly to approve a radical treaty for fossil fuel emissions reductions that would cripple many American and Western manufacturing industries. So again, it's self-aware that it's propping up the interests of capital. And also at that time, I think the most reasonable assessment of the threat to capital was action on climate change back in 2005, when it seemed like there might be something that could happen at the UN. But also there's this interesting balance of, on one hand, I think we need to do long-term scenario planning. And on the other hand, the main skill that movements need is to learn how to pivot, because shit's changing so quickly that our ability to anticipate too far ahead is really being challenged, which is why I think actually, like, planning for multiple scenarios is more useful to get the practice of how would I respond to this or that or this or that, so that it enables you to pivot. It's more valuable for that reason than because any particular thing you might prepare for is the thing that's going to play itself out over the long term. Because 5 years from now, who knows what the world's going to look like? I mean, we have the broad contours, and I also think one of the reasons why I appreciate the project of this show is that when you root yourself in, a material analysis, you actually can extend a sense of where things are going into the future, because you're looking at the foundation of a thing, whereas everything that's happening on top of the foundation is going to be a mess. Like, that's really hard to predict what's going to happen. But the trajectory, yeah.
Do you think, though, that this is also where some of the more, like, the kind of like spiritual capacity building, for lack of a better word, can come into? Because you can also start to the ability to have that sort of dispassionate sense of your enemies, and also the ability to not be so fixed, is fundamental to that kind of pivot capacity, while still having, like, actual strategic capacity and looking into the future.
Yeah, they're both aspects of strategy. And I do believe in the hard-nosed kind of, like, modeling aspect of strategy, but also, like, the movie I'm most excited to see, that I don't know if it's out yet, but there's a new Bruce Lee movie called Be Like Water. And I haven't seen it yet, but I suspect if it is what I think it is, I think it's going to be a thing that I recommend to activists to watch for strategy reasons. Because if you know how to pivot in the moment, if you know how to maintain your center and your anchor through changing conditions, then you know how to move through the coming terrain. And that's fundamentally the skill. And that's why you need to have an anchor. Otherwise, you're going to get distracted by the sideshow of politics.
Right. You got anything on that, David?
I mean, flexibility is important. That's how any real movement has developed. I've been talking a lot about the American populist movement. That wasn't something that came out of a playbook. That was something that came out of directly organizing farmers and laborers across this country and saying, what are your needs? What can we do? And then from that, organically developing, political organizations and social organizations that were able to, build a very viable and strong, one of the best, like, left-wing populist movements that we've ever seen in this country. And I think that, So like having the ability to sort of be able to map out different directions and different possibilities is something that's going to be crucial for any movement, and also to recognize that our opponents, are willing to use pretty nasty tactics against us. I think one thing that's been so frustrating, because it has a kernel of truth to it, has been like this outside agitator, story that has happened at a lot of these protests. Right? Don't get me wrong. There are right-wing outside agitators. There are police who show up, with like the goal of disrupting protests. But it also creates a dynamic where everybody's watching everybody, right? And it creates a sense of like, paranoia, and that's also a part of the tactic. And I think that people, when you fall into that trap, right, then you don't realize actually why your opponent is doing what they're doing to you, right? Because you're fixating too much on yourself and not on yourself in a selfish way, but you're not being able to say like, okay, how would the state try to derail this movement? How would the right wing try to derail this movement? Well, by destroying the most powerful part of this movement, which is social solidarity with people who are new, strangers to you, right? If you can destroy that, then you can destroy a movement. So that was something that, comes from not having that kind of flexibility and being able to recognize, how your opponents are trying to play against you as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why, one of, my friends, Adrienne Marie Brown, talks about moving at the speed of trust. And, that's how you know how fast you can move. And I want to share a quick infiltration story, which is, it speaks to, what you're talking about, David, is like, I've really seen groups get torn apart out of suspicion about infiltration. And it can be real. And so I don't tell this story to promote the notion that we're all being infiltrated everywhere. But in 2007, there was the U.S. Social Forum was in Detroit. And in Dearborn, Michigan, there was a restaurant worker organizing campaign by Restaurant Workers United. And they asked the Ruckus Society, which is a group that I was a part of, who was in town as outside agitators for the U.S. Social Forum, to help them with a series of actions pressuring these restaurant owners about rights for their members. They were trying to form a union in a couple different places and wanted to scare the owners into acquiescing to it. And so the tactics themselves that we were going to be doing were really mild and almost like we were taunting them. They were like flash mobs and stuff in these restaurants. And so we would have these practice flash mob, like dance practice, basically, in the days leading up to it. And the police force in Dearborn, Michigan had heard that there were these protests coming, and they sent 2 officers to infiltrate our meeting. And we immediately knew who they were because they showed up, and they were like huge. They looked like Navy SEALs. They looked like like they were so, and I do want to say that, like, just because someone's out of place at your meeting, please don't assume they're a cop. But these people were obviously cops, and so we in order, and it was also the kind of whatever. This is kind of silly, but we were like, oh hey, y'all are new. And just so you know, new people at the meeting have to come to the front and be dancing in front of everyone else. And we had them dance for us and do the most ridiculous dances. And it was really silly. And they knew we were they knew that we knew. And it was like, it wasn't that antagonistic of a situation. But it was so satisfying to just make them dance for us. And then the next day we did the action, and they were there in uniform, and they were like, and they were kind of smiling at us, and it was kind of a joke to them too. But it was really, really satisfying.
I remember going to a World Bank IMF protest, and it was really funny because we were doing an orientation that included civil disobedience training. And the guy who was leading it, he just was like, and before we go further, and if anybody here is an undercover member of law enforcement, we would like you to leave now. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Just like this, like public service announcement. Like, hey, get the fuck out.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.